All right, so for people who aren't aware, Compact Magazine is one of these kind of post-liberal magazines. It's not explicitly conservative, but it's not very progressive either. It's kind of in that IDW, the left left me. I'm a disaffected liberal, and now I find myself talking to conservatives. Very much exists in kind of that area, and that's good. It's good to have those publications. They have done some good work. They've published guys like Nick Land, and those have been very good articles. The guy who wrote this one is Jacob Savage. The piece is called The Lost Generation. And we're going to talk about the subject more broadly, but the reason I want to frame it inside this article is just the amount of attention that it received, especially from, I would say, the right people, the tastemakers, right? This is a narrative that you have, I think, put together pretty clearly, Jeremy, especially in your book, The Unprotected Class. However, for some reason, because this publication with this status and this position kind of laid things out, I think in a way that is more sympathetic to the creative class, perhaps, this one really caught on. There's a couple of things to praise about the article, but let's probably begin with one thing it gets very right. It does a good job of laying out the statistics, just the stunning numbers, the shift over time in these critical organizations, showing how they moved from being not only less white and less male, but also simultaneously, and perhaps a little spicier, being much worse at their jobs.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It laid out those statistics in a pretty compelling way, and I think that was certainly one of the good things it did. Although, as I commented elsewhere, I mean, I think folks like myself and Heather McDonald have sort of done this in book form at other times, and kind of what I take away from it a little bit is that people don't read books, even books that sell pretty well. But I do think that he did a good job, and some of those were updated, and some of those statistics were new. I think the real, if I can kind of put on my academic hat for a second, I think the real contribution, the intellectual contribution that he made, that I'd sort of seen done informally. I mean, I talked about this with folks like Lomez, who was kind of demographically a very similarly situated creative class millennial, like the author, but I'd never seen done in a systematic way. It really does show how there was a real generational impact. So the millennials here really got the short end of a stick in the way that even though this was going on, and this was one of my criticisms of the piece, it was going on when Gen Xers like me were coming up. It was not as severe. It was not as totalizing. And so I think it's good that he documented that. Again, I'd say an issue, though, where he fell a little bit short is it's still going on for Zoomers. They're in no better situation than their millennial forebears. In fact, it's arguably worse for Zoomers out there. And so there was a little bit of a solipsistic nature of it, where the piece, he's kind of like, well, look at all these bad things that happened to me and just me and my group. Whereas in fact, no, it happened before you, even to a pretty significant degree. And it's happening just as badly, if not worse, after you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we'll get into the criticisms here as well, because I do think that this is where the piece repeatedly falls short. He lays out this compelling case about all the discrimination, how it's been going on for decades, how you're right. There was a great increase, and he kind of points to 2013, 2014 as the hinge moment where this thing really started to kick in. And then obviously with the death of George Floyd, it goes into just an absolute crusade overdrive where he describes these meetings where like you just had CEOs and leaders just desperately trying to hire black people for anything. Oh, there's a black woman, just hire her to do what? I don't care. Just put her on the payroll, so we have one more, in our cap. And so he kind of captures that level of like just fanaticism that is running through the institutions at the time. But as you say, this is a program that exists well before the millennials, and he acknowledges that to some extent, saying, okay, well, yes, there was an imbalance, there was a preference, but it wasn't that bad. It was, you could still make it as a talented person, and then focus on the fact that then you saw truly talented people kind of being ejected from these institutions over this racial preference. But then at the end of the piece, he talks about his son and what their dreams will be, and what will he tell them. And I'm just thinking, you got no answer, buddy. Like, you got nothing, because ultimately his conclusion is really just, well, white men did this to white men. And so really, this white men were in power, and then white men handed that to someone else. And so really, it's just about white men victimizing white men, and we should just do better. Which I think is just kind of a disastrous way to conclude what otherwise I think is a relatively compelling narrative about how we ended up here.
Right. I think that's certainly true. So I think he narrows the victim or the perpetrator list too much because there are a lot of other minorities have agency, and when you dare I say it, if you remove them from their agency of doing negative things, that's kind of racist. One might even call it the soft bigotry of low expectations.
So the white man's burden here, right?
Right. So we should certainly hold people, even though I do think there were a lot of boomer in particular, and to a lesser extent Gen X, white male bad actors here. They were not the only ones. So I think that is a piece of it. And I think the two other kind of pieces that are really the central piece of my own critique, which is on my Substack, sort of titled "Why the Lost Generation is a Lost Opportunity," is one that his victim group is, to me, not the most compelling or complete victim group. It's really, the article he's written is about white male creative class liberals. And I make the point in my own piece that, frankly, those sorts of jobs, they basically lost a factional civil war on their side. And now, like a lot of these IDW types, they're kind of going back and crying and saying, hey, this isn't fair, and this is awful. But if you were conservative, and folks like myself, this has been closed off. These sorts of opportunities were closed off for quite a bit earlier than 10 years ago. So I think that's thing one. Secondly, it erases, I think this is sort of even more fundamental, because we shouldn't just obsess about Hollywood writer jobs and academic jobs and some of these other things, even though they're important. But if you were a white working class man, this most certainly did not start in 2013. When you talk about the destruction of your neighborhood, when you talk about your job being shipped off to a foreign country, these sorts of things started decades ago. And so I think there's a little bit of myopia here in his kind of outlook. And again, he's chosen a victim group that I don't think conservatives should find at least the most compelling victim group. The second problem I had, and I think you were sort of kind of alluding to it in your own comments, is that he doesn't really say what we should do, and he doesn't encourage us to stand up and say, hey, no, this is wrong. We're not going to put up with this. If anything, there's a little bit of an intellectual battered spouse syndrome here. He is kind of too scared to say, hey, the people who did this to us, they're bad. They're wrong. These were not people who were otherwise good people who just had the sort of unique blind spot that they were not so nice to white guys. These were really bad people doing bad things, and we need to call them out for doing bad things and take the sorts of political and legal actions that will get them to stop doing those bad things and punish them for bad things that they have done in the past, especially when those things are frankly contrary to American law.
Hey guys, if you've been watching this show for a while, then you know that around here we encourage something that conservatives usually don't do. Winning. If you like what I'm doing here and you want to keep it going, then head over to Blaze TV. They have the behind-the-scenes content, exclusives, and documentaries that you're just not going to see anywhere else. So go to blazetv.com/Auron and subscribe today. The promo code is AURON, and you'll save $20 right now off the annual plan.